Because this week there was a whirlwind around the alleged or so-called intelligence report commissioned by Eldred. There are some reports that also suggest that that came at a cost of some 50 million rand. However, appearing before Scopa essentially this week, the SIU, the Hawks, as well as the South African Police Services and the board of Eskom, they all say they have not caught sight or wind of, well, they have caught wind, but they have not caught sight of that intelligence report by Eldred. The police minister, Bheki Cele, went further to reveal that some 2 billion rand has been spent on security at Eskom, with some 6,000 private security personnel to take care of security at the power utility. We also heard from the electricity minister as well as the president appearing before Parliament this week around the electricity issue. So what to make of all of this? Eldred Klerk from the Africa Centre for the Africa Centre for Security and Intelligence Praxis joins us now to talk more about this week's events around energy. I lose my words even. Thank you very much, Eldred, for joining us this morning. Okay, so let's start with this intelligence report, because it would appear that on the side of authorities, not the SIU, not the Hawks, not the South African Police Services, not the board of Eskom has seen this intelligence report. And then you have sectors of society that say, well, Eldred was not cleared to conduct such an intelligence report because of sensitive information or state security possibly being at risk. What does that mean?
Thank you, and good day to you all. Probably all of those questions and concerns should remain. Firstly, intelligence is the purview of the state. Yes, we have private entities who, under license and registration, undertake some sort of information gathering. Often, sometimes that could be covert. So intelligence, by definition, is a covert activity that nobody knows that you're conducting, not the persons of interest, nor the people conducting those activities. If that is in fact what Eldred contracted other people to do, then you should think that that was done on behalf and out of concern for what is happening at Eskom, and that the principal recipients of that should either be the responsible minister and or the president, cabinet or parliament, and that it's not particularly a public document. So the only person who can firstly give clarity as to who directed this particular information gathering exercise, who was the principal intended recipient of this, and then what was the outcome of it, is Eldred, unfortunately. So we should be concerned, because we don't know when this report necessarily was completed or conducted. And then if we had that information in a timeliest manner, there could have been much earlier intervention. And hopefully we could have got to identify more clearly how Eskom is vulnerable and what risk it's under.
Here's what the head of the SIU told Scopa this week. Let's take a look, listen at this.
Our interest to seek certain clarifications and answers to certain questions in terms of what has transpired here. So we really just indicate that we would need to understand who authorized the appointment of the private investigating company that the former CEO referred to. And why would Eskom appoint private investigating company when the allegations could have been referred to the SIU or to the GPCI or State Security Agency for investigation? Whether the report of the private investigating company was handed to Eskom and presented to the accounting authority, which is the board. Now, if the report was so presented to Eskom or accounting authority, we would definitely want to have access to that report to consider it for further investigations that could be required from a recovery perspective, and probably from maladministration, and although, of course, from a corruption perspective.
This says various security state agencies were not able to answer certain questions because we are made to understand that investigations are also ongoing. I mean, the basic thing that many South Africans are concerned about is actually having electricity. So when we hear all of these events that we heard playing themselves out in Parliament, and now we understand there's also investigations around sabotage and theft, wide scale at that, at Eskom, what does it tell you?
Well, it continues to, unfortunately, undermine confidence in the state and its public enterprises and its public service departments. We've known from various commissions, no more so than the Zondo Commission, that there has been a onslaught on the state and its assets, and that its ability to deliver has systematically been eroded, and that there's been efforts to cause a collapse in the state's efficiency and effectiveness. And we understand that there are both criminal and political interest in doing so. In fact, what we saw in July 2021 could have been a further illustration of the onslaught on the state and our confidence in the state, because all that the opponents or adversaries of an effective state stood at that time was harness the dissatisfaction, disillusionment, and even disapproval of the populace on the one hand, and then of course the impetus of the Jacob Zuma trial and verdict, and then their own political and or criminal interest in harnessing all of that. And then the state went so far as we continue to do, as to underestimate particular adversaries of the state. And then what we see now with Eskom is a perfect illustration of what we in intelligence circles call a counter-systemic threat. Within the ANC, as we call the counter-revolution. So there are those who, for their own criminal and political and self-interest gains, effectively are waging war against the state. And this is just a typical example of that.
Speaking of political and self-interest gains, here's what we heard from the head of the Hawks, Godfrey Lebeya.
Thank you, Chairperson. With regard to the investigations of the politicians relating to Eskom matters we do not have. On the status of the case reported by Mr. Maimane, it is currently under investigation. What needs to be done is that there are certain people that need to be approached so that we get their side of the story for the purpose of presenting the matter to the NPA.
There is an allegation that there are certain political figures that are responsible for the destruction of Eskom. With regards to that case by Mr. Maimane, that's in reference to him laying a charge against Andre de Ruyter. But when you hear the response of the Hawks, what does that tell you?
Well, it tells us the sensitive nature of any of this kind of investigations. Firstly, if they don't have information, they can't make any kind of claims. They underline the process that they have to do. The only disappointing part of that input from the head of the Hawks is that there are certain people to be approached, which I think belies the urgency of this matter. Yes, we have to tread carefully. Yes, due process has to be followed, and any investigation in terms of gathering evidence and the chain of evidence has to have integrity, and no rush process can undermine that. However, we understand the impact of load shedding and power outages in South Africa, both on the economy, both in our confidence in the state, and in the quality of life of all of us, and even the fact that we might be losing people, losing lives during this process. So we would hope that the Hawks and any other entity tasked with investigating this would act with haste and do so, yes, under the provisions of the law, and make sure that they respect and uphold the law while they're doing that. But no effort should be spared, and we should recognize that the matter is urgent and it's for immediate action, and this should be accompanied by the necessary political will to undertake said action.
Because we are also made to understand, the Police Minister Klerk, during that meeting with Scopa in the week, revealing that some 2 billion rand has been spent on security, with 6,000 private security guards also being deployed to various Eskom plants. When you think of that money, so much of it just dedicated to security and so many people, on top of having the military also some 800 SANDF members also deployed, what should we understand about that when you hear that kind of money that is being spent on just security?
Well, security of a national state asset, of course, is the purview of firstly, our local law enforcement agencies and the law enforcement departments of local and provincial and municipal government, in particular the South African Police Service, and as a secondary mandate, the South African National Defence Force. We also know that a lot of this has already been, Eskom has already had private security companies in place who do access control, who do perimeter patrols, and tend to secure certain physical assets. So what we need to understand is that the spend comes after the fact, and in doing so, you often spend more money to shore up or stopgap vulnerabilities in your security provisions. What we are hoping as South Africans is that spend is justified, because we would hope that what has been put in place is not the sole measure or sole remedy. That in fact there's a more coherent and comprehensive strategy in place that looks at ensuring that going forward, not only do we secure physically and otherwise secure a principal energy provider like Eskom, but that we ensure that there's ongoing and sustainable energy security by making sure that systems are in place and processes are in place and oversight is in place and the political leadership is in place to ensure that it's well governed and that it effectively delivers on its primary mandate, which is to ensure the energy of security of South Africa. And then in addition to that, the rest of the state budget, which is finite, continues to look at issues of development, continues to look at issues of quality of life, and ensure that we have food, energy, transport, and quality of life and environmental security going forward, that we have clean water to drink and clean air to breathe. The state has not delivered and hasn't taken us into its confidence as to its comprehensive security strategy going forward. And we would hope that the dialogue now gets beyond Eskom to look at other issues of concern, which is transport, which is food, and the general cost of living, affordable and reliable public transport, decent public housing. And I put the emphasis on public, not private, because going forward, most of us cannot afford to enroll in a private healthcare, for example. We cannot afford to rent at exorbitant cost. We cannot afford to use public transport that is way beyond. That sees most of us spend 40 to 60% on our income. So energy is one thing. Ongoing public health and safety concerns is another, and then quality of life is even a third. So Eskom needs a basket of remedies, including security, but also maintenance, diversification of energy provision, for example. What is the role of local and provincial government in providing energy? You and I cannot afford all the time to be putting solar systems in place. It's good and it's laudable for government to start doing that in low-cost housing provision, and we thank them for that. How do we offset this cost against going after those who benefited from Eskom and the corruption at Eskom that we know is there, and seizing their assets and making sure that there's a recovery process to ensure that the money that is taken out of the system comes back into the system to offset the cost of this kind of emergency measure, because that's what it is. But we cannot have the stopgap. We need the reassurance that there's a bigger plan, that there's the political will to follow through with it, and there's the political will to learn the lessons of what your input said, advice given way back in the 90s of what could and should be done to ensure that we have energy security going forward. Without that reassurance, we run the risk of this being wasteful expenditure.
Africa Center for Security and Intelligence Praxis, Eldred de Klerk. Thank you very much for your time this morning.